Do you like stories? Yes. This is Greek mythology. A man by the name of Ulysses set out with his warriors and his crew from the island of Ithaca in Greece to retrieve a woman of great beauty named Helen. Helen was the wife of King Menelaus in Greece, and Ulysses wanted to rescue her. She had been seduced and kidnapped by Paris, the prince of Troy. Troy is where kind of modern Turkey is today. And so Ulysses sets out, and you may recall some of the story that Ulysses and his men built the Trojan horse. Remember the Trojan horse made out of wood, and then they climbed inside of it, and the warriors of Troy wheeled it into the city thinking that it was a gift from the Greeks. And in turn, in the middle of the night, out came all the warriors, and they basically overran the city and took Helen back. And now they're sailing back, a 10-year journey to get back to Ithaca. And you can read all about that in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in the course of going back to Ithaca with his crew and Helen, and they're making their way past the islands of the Sirens. The islands of the Sirens. Who are the Sirens anyway? Well, the Sirens were demons disguised as beautiful naked women who sang this sensual, mesmerizing song. And sailors who, okay, granted, they're a little horny. Sailors have not been around women for quite a while, and they hear this song from the Sirens. They see them and all of their sensuality. They want to gratify themselves. They steer their ships to the island where the Sirens are, only to find it's been surrounded by sharp rocks. They crash their ships against the rocks, and then the demons come out and feast on their flesh. Hello. And so Ulysses has got to go past the islands of the Sirens. And he says to his men, he knows all of this, and he says to his men, when we go past the island of the Sirens, take beeswax, put that in your ears so you don't hear their song. But me, I want to hear it. Lash me to the mast. Tie me up tight to the mast, and no matter what I tell you, no matter what I do, no matter how many threats I give you, do not unleash me. Do not untie me. And so they make their way past the island of the Sirens, and the Sirens are wooing them. The men can't hear it, but Ulysses can, and he's screaming at his men. And he's threatening his men to unleash him so that he can go. It's that seductive. And finally they make it past, and they untie Ulysses, and they make it back to Ithaca. But all of his days, the siren song was in his heart. He could never get rid of it. He could never get rid of it. And what kept him from following his desires was external constraint, right? He was tied to the mast because in his heart, he wanted to go. He wanted to go crash on the rocks. That is kind of the way temptation is, isn't it? Temptation seduces us, and then there is a huge crash. So you yield to temptation and you sin, and then you feel guilty and ashamed and embarrassed, and you condemn yourself. And the pain is way worse than the satisfaction, the momentary, fleeting pleasures of sin. I want to focus in the time that we have this morning on the area of sex, because sex is a huge issue within the Church of Jesus Christ. About 3 years ago, Josh McDowell and his ministry contracted with George Barna and the Barna Research Institute to do a study on the effects and really the dissemination of pornography among evangelical Christian men. The results are discouraging. About 60% of all evangelical Christian men view pornography at least once a month. And pastors, about a third of them. How do you lead a flock into holiness and purity if you're looking at porn? How do you do that? I mean, that's shocking to me. But you know, we live in a very sexualized culture, don't we? The culture all around us is selling us sex because Madison Avenue knows sex sells. If I want to sell a product, I put a pretty girl in there, preferably showing a lot of skin. I'm going to sell you you may not even know what the product is. You're going to buy it anyway because of her. And so you find there's a lot of skin shown on magazines as you go through the checkout lines. Cosmo's famous for that. And then cable television. Hell's Box Office, HBO. And now they've got a new series called Game of Thrones. What's the Game of Thrones all about? Well, I don't know. I've never seen it, but I do know an interview that they did with Emilia Clarke, and she's one of the stars of Game of Thrones. She said she learned more about sex from Game of Thrones and from filming Game of Thrones than she ever did in biology class. Take that for what it's worth, but I'm just telling you that that's a very sexualized program on HBO. Sex is on billboards. I remember about 15 years ago when I was on the staff of a church, and I would drive down 694 and turn off onto 169 to go down to the church, and there was a huge billboard that Clear Channel had, and the billboard was of a naked woman in a bodysuit, a flesh-covered bodysuit. I don't think there's 100,000 cars go by that billboard every day. I have no idea if any of us could tell you what she was selling. But the State Highway Patrol petitioned Clear Channel to take down that billboard because they had suffered a dozen rear-end crashes from men crashing into other cars while guys were gawking at the billboard. That's a problem. And then, of course, there's the internet. Estimates are as high as 60% of the internet is sexualized websites. So if you're going on the internet, pretty good chance that you're going to run into one of them. So it's a problem. It's a problem. And you can take the Ulysses approach to the problem. And the Ulysses approach to the problem is try harder. Try harder. It's a little bit like white knuckling. Those of you familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, you understand what white knuckling is. It's where you want to drink so bad, but you're not going to have one, and you're gripping the bar so tight, even though there's that whiskey and the beer chasers right in front of you, and you're gripping it so tight your knuckles are turning white, but you're not going to drink it because you're going to go to the AA meeting, you're going to have to report to your sponsor. Oh, no, you're not going to drink it, but your knuckles are turning white because you want it. Just like Ulysses. First point, temptation is not sin. Jesus was tempted in all points like as we, yet without sin. Temptation is not a sin. To be tempted is human. And the devil specializes in tempting. He is the tempter. Sin is when you yield to temptation to violate your own moral standards and the standards of God. The siren song of sexual sin is everywhere. It's luring good men to come and crash their ship and in turn imbibe on that which they know is wrong. Sin is pleasurable. Hebrews tells us that. It says of Moses that he chose to endure suffering with the people of Israel rather than partake of the passing pleasures or the fleeting pleasures of sin. Sin is pleasurable. So temptation is not sin. Sin is pleasurable. It is pleasurable. And you can resist for a while. The flesh is pretty strong at resisting for a little while. But then at some point, the flesh grows weak. And now, all of a sudden, you're in the position of where you're no longer resisting. And there are 6 trigger things that trigger you. Here they are. Resisting in the flesh. Here's 6 triggers that trigger men into yielding to sexual sin. The first is when they're hurting. They're hurting because maybe they got fired. Maybe they had an argument with their wife. They're hurting in some capacity. And so they want to medicate themselves through sexual sin. Typically pornography. Typically pornography. They're angry. They're angry with their wives. They got into a fight. Maybe they're angry with their boss. Maybe they're angry with their kids. Maybe they're angry at the guy that drove next to them and cut them off. So they're angry. And they take their anger out. I'm going to show my wife. She can't tell me what to do. And so I'm going to gratify myself sexually. Lonely. Nobody's home. That's a real deadly one. Nobody's home. Wife is gone. I'm all alone. Tied in a little bit with number 5. I'm bored. I got nothing to do. And so I gratify myself sexually that way. When I'm tired, I'm vulnerable. Very vulnerable when I'm tired. And the devil knows that, and he comes at me, and he tempts me, and I'm tired. My resistance is down. Bored, talked about that, and then curious. I wonder what would happen if I typed into Internet Explorer XXX. What would come up? I think you have a pretty good idea what would come up. All of those are triggers that can trigger you. Well, sexual sin, thirdly, is a unique sin. It's unique in a lot of ways. Listen to 1 Corinthians 6:18. It says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. So it's not that sexual sin is a worse sin than any other, but it is a unique sin. And you say, Irv, how is it unique? Well, let me just think with me about this a little bit. No other sin that you commit can conceive a soul that will spend eternity either in heaven or hell. Sexual sin can. Alcoholism can't. Drug addiction can't. Gambling can't. Overworking can't. Overeating can't. There's no other sin quite like sexual sin because it can produce an eternal soul that's going to live someplace, heaven or hell. That's unique. Sets it apart as being a unique sin. Well, God designed marriage to be a protection for us from sexual sin. And so, God's design for our protection is marriage. Let me say some things that are a little bit countercultural. This is God's design for marriage, what He says marriage should look like. For one thing, God says that marriage is to be heterosexual. If I go back to Genesis 2, it's one man and one woman. And that's the pattern that God set. Is it violated in scriptures? I never see homosexual marriage anywhere commended or even written about too much in scripture. A little bit with Sodom and Gomorrah, but not much in terms of even talking about homosexual marriage. It's not in there. It's heterosexual. So heterosexual, one male, one female. It's monogamous, one spouse. Yeah, I know Solomon had 900 women. What did he have? 700 wives and 200 concubines, or 600 wives and 300? All I know is a humongous number of women. So if you slept with Solomon, you'd see him about every 3 years. Anyway, it's monogamous. It's one at a time, one spouse. And then it's to be permanent. It's to be permanent. And that's God's design for our protection. And it's marriage. All sexual energy is to be directed to our spouse. And if you're struggling with pornography, you're struggling with sexual sin, and you're single, what is that telling you? The Apostle Paul says, better to marry than to burn. So it's time to start thinking about marriage, guys, if you're single and you're finding yourself sexual sinning or viewing pornography on a regular basis. Marriage alone can really produce true intimacy. True intimacy is oneness. And it's oneness not only with our spouse, which is intimacy, but it's oneness with God as well. It's on the vertical and it's on the horizontal. What is intimacy anyway? A lot of guys equate intimacy with sex, and yeah, that's true. Sex is certainly part of that. But intimacy is more than that. Intimacy is oneness. And when you're in a marriage relationship or when you're in union with Christ, you have intimacy, real intimacy. Now, what is it about oneness? A pastor friend of mine defined intimacy this way. He says, with my wife and in my marriage, I want her to into me see. Into me see. Let me be like a transparent glass that she can see my heart. She can see what's going on because she wants to connect with me and be one with me. So does God. God wants to be one with you. And when you're honest and when you're transparent, intimacy is the fruit of that. And Genesis 2:24 talks about that. It says, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. And by the way, it goes on in verse 25 and says, and the man and his wife, so now they're married, the man and his wife were naked and not ashamed. Or as they say down south, they was naked. They were naked and not ashamed. What's the issue with pornography and true intimacy? How does pornography affect true intimacy? Pornography is, in a lot of ways, is a symptom of a lack of true intimacy in a marriage, and it's the lack of true intimacy with God. So if you're viewing pornography on a regular basis, it's probably because you don't have true intimacy with your spouse. You don't have true intimacy with your wife, and you don't have true intimacy with God, because that's where it really all originates. So no matter what you're doing, no matter how religious you are, you don't have true intimacy if that's what you're running to, because now pornography has become the God of your life. It's idolatry. It's idolatry. The devil seeks to pervert whatever God has said is good. And so, with pornography, pornography is part of the devil's substitute for true sexual intimacy. Pornography produces false intimacy. There are three components to it to produce false intimacy: pornography, masturbation, sexual fantasizing. And a lot of single guys have told me, what do I need a wife for? I can enjoy and fulfill myself sexually without one just through pornography, masturbation, and fantasy. I don't need a wife. What is God's design? All sexual energy goes to my wife, belongs to her. Don't let your stream overflow its banks to another. Stay with the wife of your youth. Stay with the wife of your youth. Well, what kind of false intimacy does pornography produce? Here's my experience as I've counseled almost 7,000 men on this issue. There are dabblers, pornography dabblers. And porn dabblers look at pornography maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, for less than 15 minutes. It pops up. Somebody shows them or sends them an email with it. And so they look at it for about 15 minutes, but it's not part of their lives typically. And then there's the porn opportunists. And porn opportunists are guys who will look at other people's pornography as it's passed on to them. They may search it out themselves, but it's about once a month activity. It's for less than an hour. The guys that I wind up dealing with as a counselor are guys that are in the last category, porn addicts. And porn addicts are looking at pornography for a day, every day, typically for more than 2 hours. They go to the land of numb. And they're on there, they don't even know how long they're on there. And they're going from site to site to site because pornographers are very smart. And they will keep you clicking onto the next porn website. And they are hooked on it. And their marriage is in trouble. Their relationship with God is non-existent. And in general, it's very toxic. And that's what pornography can produce. False intimacy. A couple of things concerning false intimacy. It is the devil's alternative to sexual satisfaction and true intimacy, and it can never satisfy the soul. Almost done. Here's the last story. Real short little story. A guy named Jason sets out from Greece, and he and his men on board the good ship Argo, Jason and the Argonauts, sounds like a rock band. Anyway, Jason and the Argonauts set out from Greece, and they're in search of the Golden Fleece. And they too have to pass by the islands of the Sirens. But Jason takes a very different approach to going past the island of the Sirens. No more beeswax for their ears. Instead, he says to his men, we're not going to do any of that. You're not going to lash me to the mast like Ulysses. We're going to invite Orpheus on board. Orpheus is the greatest singer in all of Greece. Greatest lyre and flute player in all of Greece. And so they invite Orpheus on. And when they approach the island of the Sirens, Jason says to Orpheus, sing your loudest, sing your sweetest, sing your best songs, play loud. And so they sail, and the sweet song of Orpheus was so powerful that the men, including Jason, never even heard the sirens. That's the goal. The goal is to have the sweet song of Jesus in your heart. It's not enough to do behavior modification. It's not enough to just stop masturbating, stop looking at pornography, stop fantasizing, taking thoughts captive. That's not enough. If we don't change your heart, you'll keep falling back into it again. The flesh is weak. But if the sweet song of Jesus is in your heart, He is the answer. He alone can transform the heart to no longer desire sexual sin. That's what you're after. He alone can give true intimacy with God and with your wife, and He alone can satisfy your soul. So the question comes to you and me. Is the sweet song of the Savior in your soul? Is He protecting you from sexual sin? If He's not, come talk to me. I've been there. I know what it's all about. I've lived a double life. I know all about what it's like to be a pastor and living a double life looking at porn on the side. So come talk to me, and we'll see what we can do. God bless you.